is a touchstone of our experience with the French and Indian War. We have very few resources that survive from the French and Indian War period, and this one is preserved and handed down to us 3 centuries later in pristine condition.
The 20 years before the American Revolution were very significant in the ultimate development of North America, and people just are not as aware of that. So the RADEAU is an interesting poster child for that, if you will.
Just recognizing how old this is, how large it is, how intact it is. I mean, there's nothing else like this that you could see underwater.
People believe that time travel is impossible. I say it is. When you dive on the RADEAU, you're literally transported back in time over 200 years. You are looking at a vessel that is the only remaining example of that class of vessel in the world, totally intact, like the day it sunk. There are no other examples of this warship in the world. None that are close to bringing us back to that time in history. This is a time machine. It is a time capsule. It is a one of a kind in the world.
Lost for over 2 centuries, North America's oldest intact warship rested hidden and undisturbed in the depths of a cold mountain lake in present-day New York State. Then 232 years after the vessel sank, it was discovered, a well-preserved icon of the French and Indian War. Take a journey with us as we explore one of the most historic but little-known warships in American history, the 52-foot-long Land Tortoise, flagship of the Sunken Fleet of 1758.
This vessel is intact. In fact, it's really one of the few remaining military structures made of wood that's intact of this era. This is like an original floating fort, a RADEAU, completely intact. But this is an American ship. It was built by American shipwrights and has every right to, make a claim as the oldest intact warship in North America.
Within the Adirondack Park in northern New York lies Lake George, a 32-mile-long glacial-formed waterway. The lake is a popular recreational destination, and it is also renowned for its historical sites and the many battles that occurred here during the 18th century. Known as the Queen of American Lakes because of its unusually clear waters and scenic surroundings, Lake George was the site of some of the most decisive fighting during the French and Indian War, from 1755 to 1763, in which Britain and France, along with their Native American allies, battled for control of the continent.
The only means of transportation were the waterways. The Hudson River, Lake George, Lake Champlain, the Richelieu River, St. Lawrence River. So this was the waterway that connected French Canada to the English colonies. So control of this strategic waterway would mean, control of the land.
For over 100 years, the French called the waterway Lac du Saint-Sacrement, meaning Lake of the Blessed Sacrament. In 1755, William Johnson named it Lake George, in honor of King George II of Britain. That year, one of the fiercest battles ever fought on American soil, the Battle of Lake George, ended in a British victory. and the construction of an earth and wooden fortification named Fort William Henry to safeguard Britain's North American land claims.
This now became a bone of contention for the French, having an English settlement this far north on an area that Native Americans still believed was their territory. And their allies, the French, would assist them in getting rid of this fort on their territory.
However, nearly 2 years after its construction, in March of 1757, a French army from the Champlain Valley crossed ice-covered Lake George in a surprise attack on Fort William Henry.
The French and the Native Americans were unable to destroy the fort. However, they did burn 2 sloops, nearly all of the bateaux, and some other smaller vessels. So it was a close call for the fort, but it did survive that March attack.
5 months later, in August of 1757, Fort William Henry fell after a 6-day siege by the French and their Native American allies. This event inspired the 1826 historical novel The Last of the Mohicans, written by James Fenimore Cooper. In 1758, 15,000 British regulars and provincial soldiers with support from Iroquois warriors launched an offensive to seize the 2 French strongholds in the Champlain Valley to the north, Forts Carillon and St. Frederick. On July 8, 1758, the French forces unexpectedly defeated a much larger British army at Fort Carillon, later known as Fort Ticonderoga. The British then retreated to their stronghold at the south end of Lake George, where they undertook a massive boat-building campaign, hoping to return to Fort Carillon before the end of the year. At the head of the lake, the British constructed several large warships. One of those was a strange-looking 7-sided vessel called a RADEAU that was built under the direction of Captain Samuel Cobb and British artillery officer Captain Thomas Ord.
The word RADEAU is French for raft, and the RADEAU is kind of a subclass of a class or type of vessel called a floating gun battery. And floating gun batteries were large watercraft that were designed primarily to move heavy artillery and ordnance. Thus, the Land Tortoise, which was pierced for 7 cannons, is part of this class. It was a floating gun battery, literally a floating fortress.
Over 3 years earlier, in 1755, John Dyes, a New York ship outfitter, wrote to William Johnson, giving instructions on how to build such a floating gun battery.
He gave a simple description of what really a floating battery would evolve to be in terms of the Land Tortoise. So he was the first type of documentation for the Lake George region of this type of vessel.
The sides of this float should be raised high enough for a breastwork to cover the men, with portholes cut in them at a proper height, and also holes to run oars out through. In such a float, you might mount some of your field pieces.
Captain Samuel Cobb began construction of the Land Tortoise in mid-September. About a month later, he had completed the vessel, 52 feet long, 18 feet wide, and there are numerous accounts in the historic journals about this vessel.
On October 7, 1758, Connecticut provincial officer Colonel Henry Champion, stationed at Lake George, made an entry into his journal.
He had also, Henry Champion, drawn in his journal the 7-sided vessel and had its name, tail and end, or Land Tortoise, and other journals as well, because it was a very massive looking vessel, and one different than what had been seen by these soldiers in Massachusetts or Connecticut or Rhode Island. It wasn't a traditional vessel.
Another observer, Dr. Caleb Ray, a physician with the British forces, described the large watercraft.
One is very odd. being 7 squares sided like this figure. Besides, she tumbles in and makes 7 squares more, so that she is truly 14 square besides her bottom and top.
On October 20th, 1758, Captain Samuel Cobb reported in his journal that
we launched 2 RADEAUs.
These were the Land Tortoise and a smaller 30-foot RADEAU. Cobb noted that the following day, October 21st,
we tried the RADEAUs and rowed well. They went with 26 oars.
As winter approached, and without an adequate garrison to guarantee the security of the fleet, British and provincial troops loaded boats with rocks and sank them in shallow water with plans to retrieve them the following year. On October 22nd, William Swett, a provincial soldier at Lake George in 1758, recorded in his journal details of the deliberate sinking of the Land Tortoise.
I was forced to go to work, sinking our RADEAU, which we got ready at the sunset, and we sunk her once, but one side rise again, so we were forced to work the chief of the night before we could keep her down.
That same day, provincial shipwright Samuel Cobb wrote,
working on the RADEAUs, sinking them in the lake.
By late October 1758, the British had completed the deliberate sinking of their Mountain Lake Squadron, the sloop Earl of Halifax, 2 RADEAU, a number of row galleys, some whaleboats, and 260 bateaux. Now hidden under the lake's frozen waters, the fleet was safe from the destruction of shifting ice and French raids.
They were purposely sunk to be retrieved. I even found the evidence of a crude float type device, actually just a piece of a log with a hole drilled through it that was resting on the bottom. So I suspected that that was at one time attached by a line of some sort, which had eroded away, and probably was the means by which they would retrieve them in the spring. But their efforts at retrieval were often not successful.
The British intended that these valuable warships would be recovered in the spring of 1759 for another attack on Fort Carillon. In the late spring and early summer of 1759, when General Geoffrey Amherst's British and provincial troops started raising vessels of the Sunken Fleet of 1758, the Land Tortoise could not be found. Thus, a new RADEAU, the Invincible, had to be hastily built for use in a successful expedition by Amherst against the French. The RADEAU Land Tortoise would lie hidden in the lake, awaiting curious explorers. Underwater archaeology at Lake George began in 1960, shortly after 2 teenage scuba divers found several sunken bateaux from the Sunken Fleet of 1758. In that year, the Adirondack Museum succeeded in raising several bateaux, probably 3 from the lake.
A bateau was the main means of moving men and equipment during the colonial period because the lakes provided the best and easiest avenue of long-distance carries.
These 25 to 35-foot-long wooden vessels were flat-bottomed warships made of pine planks and oak frames. Bateaux were pointed at bow and stern. They were rowed in deeper water and sometimes rigged with a crude mast and sail. From 1963 to 1964, the Adirondack Museum launched Operation Bateau to locate and document sunken bateau craft in the waterway. Terry Crandall, an experienced diver from Richfield Springs, New York, was hired by the Adirondack Museum to undertake that task.
At first, I didn't know what to expect. I expected to see more of the evidence of a boat structure on the bottom. I realized then that I would probably had overlooked the one distinguishing feature, which is the portions of the stems that stick above the mudline, because these had been sunk over 200 years, and of course there was a tremendous amount of overburden of silt, debris from the steamboat era, and of course vegetation. To start cleaning them, removing the silt, I found that the best way was to use a hand fanning, because oftentimes would not wear fins because it would disturb sections of the boat itself.
Though several dozen bateaux were studied and mapped by Crandall, no colonial RADEAU wreck was discovered. A quarter-century later, in 1987, several local historians and divers, directed by Joseph W. Zarzinski, formed a group called the Lake George Bateau Research Team to study the waterway's sunken bateaux. Besides studying some of the bateau wrecks found and mapped in the early 1960s, the team used sophisticated side-scan sonar, trying to find an intact and undisturbed bateau in deep water. In the early 1960s, Professor Harold Edgerton of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology began experimenting with side-scan sonar technology. In 1966, one of Edgerton's MIT students, Martin Klein, introduced a single-channel towed side-scan sonar, and in 1968, he founded Klein Associates Incorporated, located in Salem, New Hampshire.
The basic thing is that side-scan sonar is a way to make an image which the eye can interpret, which can look like a photograph. So it makes a kind of photograph of the seabed.
There are three major components to any side-scan sonar system. One is the topside computer and display. The second is the tow cable. The third is the tow fish. Tow fish is a torpedo-like device that you tow behind your vessel, and it's got two transducers on it, and these transducers literally transmit and receive sound. It's like a huge ultrasound of the lake bottom, and we create images through those sound waves. Those sound waves are then transmitted up the tow cable to the computer, and it's displayed on the computer, and the operator could then see the shipwrecks.
If you want to look at a large area, the sonar allows you to go along with the ship and cover a fairly large area of the bottom in a relatively short time. That's something you can't do with optical imaging, something you can't do with divers. It also has a lot of auxiliary uses. For example, if you find a ship, you really want to study the area around it to get clues about maybe why it sank, has it moved around, is there a debris field, is there other stuff near that wreck. The fact is, side-scan sonar is a tool, and as an engineer, I believe strongly that to do any kind of engineering, you need to use all the tools at your disposal. And a good engineer will figure out the tools of the current state of the art and will use what is needed to get the job done. But in many cases, the side scan has gotten the job done and still does, and I feel very good about that.
June 26, 1990 was about 3 years into our field work, and we were conducting a side scan sonar operation to try to find that intact, pristine bateau lying on the bottom of Lake George. After 3 days of field work, we hadn't found anything much in terms of an historic shipwreck. And then a little bit of serendipity. We were heading back to port when we noticed on the sonar a large target. We immediately called for a buoy to be tossed over the side, and that marked the approximate location of a strange-looking sonograph of something in deep water.
Well, from looking at the sonar record, we knew we had something very unique down on the bottom. It was deep water, probably a virgin site that had never been looked at before. The sonar record showed something that was significant in size and unique in shape.
Because the sonar shape was so unusual. It was at parts angular, yet it seemed to be absorbing some of the sound energy from the sonar. It was decided to make a dive to ground truth the target to find out what it was. The first dive team down on the sonar target was made up of Dave Van Aken, Bob Benway, and myself. And as we descended, down into the depths, we were literally going foot by foot, but also year by year back into time.
We dropped down probably 30 to 40 feet away from the actual vessel, and again had no idea what we were looking for or what to expect. And there's always some aura of excitement. As you're swimming through the water, it's very dark down there, not a lot of light, and then you see something that's slightly darker than the rest of the bottom start to appear. And then you know that's your target. You get closer and it starts to come into shape. And when we first came across it, it was sitting up pretty high out of the water column. It was probably, 6, 7, 8 feet up. And fortunately, I came across an area where there was a cannon port. And that was pretty evident as to what it was at that point in time. 18th century RADEAU.
Following the discovery, officials with the state of New York were notified, and Zarzynski's team made several dives on the site to collect information about this very unusual historic vessel. During the summer of 1990, as this team was making secret dives to the site, Dr. Russell Bellico was gathering more historical documentation about the RADEAU class. Zarzynski and his colleagues renamed their group Bateau Below, and they assembled a team of experienced, hand-picked volunteer divers to conduct an archaeological investigation of this deep-water floating gun battery. Dr. D.K. Abbas of Newport, Rhode Island, was then invited to join the crew as the project archaeologist.
It was a risk to take because at the time, professional archaeologists were very concerned about working with the sport diving community. At the time, sport divers were known to be recreators, they were thieves, they were only interested in taking souvenirs from the sites they dived on. And it turned out that the people at Bateau Below had a very different approach to things. Joe Zarzynski was very important in making the decision because he was obviously very interested in preservation, in doing the history right, and doing the archaeology right. And to get a permit from the state to continue with the work that they had done, he had to have a professional archaeologist to get the permit. And so I agreed to do it based on that initial, it was a couple of meetings, I guess, that we had over the course of the summer with the team that came down to Newport, and we talked about how we'd be doing the work.
Armed with a permit from the state of New York, the research team studied the shipwreck from 1991 to 1993.
The interesting thing about that project is that because it was so successful, running volunteer sport divers, using professional archaeologists to make the technical decisions and the professional decisions, other places around the country have started doing the same kind of program. My own Rhode Island Marine Archaeology Project is founded on what Joe Zarzynski did at Lake George in terms of having professional archaeologists and then volunteers that are trained to come out and be involved with an archaeology project. And other states are doing the same thing too. So what Joe Zarzynski and Bateau Below did at Lake George became the model for a number of other programs around the country that have been very successful.
Following the 1990 discovery of the lost RADEAU, Bateau Below's survey of the historic shipwreck documented the vessel. Without any major grants to finance the fieldwork, the all-volunteer research team conducted several seasons of archaeological investigation to collect data about the one-of-a-kind RADEAU. In addition to the depth, over 100 feet, the project faced many other challenges.
The really difficult part of running the team was that it was a large number of divers that had a very limited dive time, bottom time, because of the depth. And because the silt was so bad, you could run only a few minutes at a time, and that means divers had to be choreographed very carefully so they'd get out of each other's way and not stir up the silt and get into that kind of a problem.
It took a long time because we made 2 dives a day, and our bottom time for the dives was quite short. Probably for the first dive we had about 15 minutes of actual working time down below. Then there was a 3-hour time period in between dives in which the divers wrote up their logs and so forth, and we made our second dive. Our second dive, we were quite conservative, and we worked for about 12 minutes bottom time. So each day our divers had about 27 minutes of working time down there using slates, tape measures, underwater cameras and so forth to document the site.
Safety concerns was first and foremost in the minds of all the divers because it was a deep dive. I would keep track of their times, their collective times, their intervals during the break time when we planned the second dive of the day, and checked for equipment. And so I was more of a overseer for the safety and concern of the divers and for coordination of the mission.
As part of the field work, a tethered underwater robot called a remotely operated vehicle, or ROV, was employed. The little robot was equipped with a color video camera, lights, and navigation displays that allowed for unlimited time to examine the sunken vessel.
The RADEAU is in over 100 feet of water. That limits the bottom time of divers. It also limits the class of diver that can be used on the wreck. And for archaeologists who weren't qualified divers or divers who weren't qualified to work at those depths, we were able to bring those people down to the site and literally see the vessel with their own eyes. Whereas previously they would have had to rely on descriptions or photographs. There's just nothing like being there. And if you can't be there physically, being there with a telepresence of an ROV is the second best way to go.
The archaeological team noted the location and dimensions of frames, stanchions, planks, iron fasteners and mooring rings, and trunnels. The location and placement of the RADEAU's cannon ports, sweep holes, view holes, and distribution of stones used to sink the RADEAU were all recorded. The project archaeologist then worked with a CAD draftsman to recreate the ship's lines. The research team's ship modeler, John Farrell, created various scale models of the Land Tortoise based upon data collected during the fieldwork. The vessel is a 52 feet long by 18 feet wide, flat-bottomed, 7-sided warship. It is an undecked vessel made of flat panels that are supported by grown frames and stanchions. The wooden warship has a protective single-planked bulwarks set on top of a hardwood hull. These bulwarks, made of pine planks, functioned as protection for soldiers inside the RADEAU. A single vertical stanchion that supported the vessel's bulwarks is still in place on the starboard side. The port side vertical stanchion, however, was apparently knocked away during the sinking. There are 7 gun ports that are offset, 4 on the port and 3 on the starboard. There are 13 oar holes per side, and 2 probable mast steps were found as well.
Ships like RADEAUs were easily built by ordinary carpenters. You didn't need skilled shipwrights to do a lot of the work. You're dealing with lumber that was straight cut. Basic carpentry skills could be used for many of the operations that could be built quickly and easily by relatively untrained carpenters rather than the skilled labor required for a fully molded ship.
2 view holes, a circular-shaped one on the port and a rectangular-shaped hole on the starboard, are also cut into the bow of the vessel. The structural integrity of the RADEAU is so well preserved that tool marks around the starboard view hole still survive. Details like this are rare and often give us insight into the shipbuilding technology of the period, as well as the urgency to complete the craft in a timely manner. Is it possible that these two view holes were cut by two different shipbuilders using different techniques? 16 frames per side, port and starboard, support the single-planked hull panels, and for every hull frame there is a corresponding groan knee to support the bulwarks. The vessel's frames appear to be hardwood, probably oak, and its upper planks seem to be pine. The hull structure is fastened by trunnels, hand-wrought nails, and drifts, and the hull is caulked and possibly tarred. The Land Tortoise would have been powered by oars and sails. The 1758 warship, in part, resembled the corner bastion of a colonial fort, and the battleship would have been a stable platform for cannons. The Land Tortoise RADEAU is the only known survivor of its class, a warship that was limited to protected waters. Until this archaeological study was undertaken, little was actually known about this class of vessel.
Why was that kind of vessel used in those kinds of waters? And then why was that type of vessel abandoned later in history? And it turned out that the RADEAU is a perfectly good ship for those kinds of waters. They're enclosed, the square rig could go up and down the lakes with prevailing winds, and she could be rowed back and forth for short periods and the like. She would not have been a very good ship for open waters, which is why once those waters were no longer under contention after the Revolutionary War was over, then the ship form drops out, and because it was no longer useful.
Following the 1991 to 1993 field investigation of the RADEAU wreck, a study of the boat's artillery was conducted by military historian Gary Payne. Payne theorizes the seven-sided Land Tortoise would have used cannons that fired 24-pound balls.
The Land Tortoise was really an ingenious war machine that was developed during the French and Indian War. It was developed, we theorize, to cover amphibious invasions and also to protect land-based military installations by anchoring a RADEAU off of a shore-based military facility. You could provide excellent artillery protection for your facility. And in the case of amphibious invasion, a RADEAU could be used to cover the invasion. You can bring your artillery right to the shore's edge and fire away.
Although no artillery pieces were found at the RADEAU site by the archaeological team, Payne suggested the cannons might have been mounted on naval or garrison-type carriages. Others, like Bateau Belot's John Farrell, believe the RADEAU's artillery could have been mounted on field carriages. When the shipwreck was found, it was missing one of its cannon port lids, and another had been dislodged by a fisherman's downrigger weight. Since then, sport divers visiting the RADEAU have knocked off 3 more lids. Dr. Bradley Rogers, a professor and conservator at East Carolina University in Greenville, North Carolina, has conserved 3 of the cannon port lids. The 3 are now under the custodial care of the New York State Museum, and Lake Georgians hope that someday one of them will be exhibited in the Lake George area. In 1993, toward the end of the archaeological field study of the sunken warship, Bateau Belot began experimenting with new technology to visually capture the shipwreck as a single image.
At the RADEAU site, due to limited water visibility and the lack of light, you simply can't back off far enough and take one photograph that's going to encompass the entire vessel. So what we do is we get up real close and take lots of little pictures, and then we paste them all together, and then the end product is called a photo mosaic. The intent of the photo mosaic was to photographically document the vessel at a certain point in time so that we could monitor any changes that might take place in the future.
The process was complicated by the size of the vessel, low visibility in the lake, and limited time underwater by the photography team due to the great depth of the shipwreck.
Over 400 photographs were taken over a period of 12 dives. And from those, I think we selected about 200 for the actual computer processing phase.
Using Adobe Photoshop, a recently developed computer software program, the research team pioneered a new photographic technique called a seamless photomosaic.
A seamless mosaic is one where all the individual photographs have been blended together so that you can't discern one individual photo from its neighbor.
The result was incredible. Following post-data collection, computer technician Kendrick McMahon completed a computerized, seamless photomosaic image. The entire process took more than 350 computer hours. Black and green colors were added for visual effect, and this became the first seamless photomosaic of a shipwreck. And it provides archaeologists with baseline data on the historic warship. The development of this process today allows archaeologists, in partnership with computer technicians, to create enhanced imaging for the interpretation of shipwrecks.
In October 1992, there was a meeting that was held in Lake George, New York. It's called the RADEAU Planning Meeting. And the idea was to present options for the Land Tortoise RADEAU and to involve the public so the public would have input on this. What are you going to do with an historic shipwreck that's in 107 feet of water? You're going to leave it there? Are you going to raise it, put it in a museum? Are you going to surround it with some type of gate to keep divers away? Or are you going to go high tech and try to image it so you can put it into a kind of a science fiction type of museum? Those were the options, and out of those came one that was the most cost effective and the most practical, and that was to create an underwater park for recreational divers.
Before it could be opened to the diving public, Bateau Below undertook the arduous process of designing and constructing a perimeter around the site that would guide visiting divers and discourage vandalism. Known as the Ring Around the RADEAU, the perimeter consisted of a series of 12 to 15 foot long, 4-inch diameter PVC posts, driven vertically several feet into the lake bottom, and then connected with plastic chain. In addition, a lead corridor was constructed to guide divers from the mooring to the perimeter. Interpretive signage was installed around the RADEAU perimeter to tell divers about the vessel, to help orient them to the RADEAU Preserve, and to remind them about safety concerns. In August 1994, the Land Tortoise opened as a submerged heritage preserve, a state-administered underwater park for scuba divers.
Well, one of the provisions of the Abandoned Shipwreck Act of 1987 was to encourage the states to provide recreational opportunities for the diving public. There was an acknowledgement that historic shipwrecks required preservation, but there was also an acknowledgement that the diving public should have access to historic shipwrecks as well. So New York's Submerged Heritage Program has been our effort to try to make some sites available for the diving public and do it in a way that reflects good stewardship for these sites.
Called Land Tortoise, a 1758 floating gun battery, the RADEAU Preserve is open to divers for viewing during designated times in the summer months. Because of its depth and the historical uniqueness of the RADEAU shipwreck, experienced scuba divers who plan to dive the shipwreck must first register with the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation.
Shipwrecks, obviously, are residing on underwater lands owned by the people of the state of New York as a public trust entity, and therefore we are responsible for those structures embedded in the sovereign lands. Other laws that reflect the shipwrecks are the education law, and no artifact can be removed or damaged or disturbed.
The archaeological study of the 1758 Land Tortoise RADEAU shipwreck continues. In late 1758, the French reconnoitered the abandoned British camp at the south end of Lake George. Did the French find the sunken RADEAU after the British sank it in 1758?
There's a lot of questions that still need to be answered about the Land Tortoise. And one of those involves the case of, was this vessel sunk and then raised and resunk in deep water, or is it where it was originally put?
Given the technology and given the fact that the French didn't have large ships on Lake George and the time of year, November, the chances that they could raise a vessel of this size and then move it to deeper water seems rather remote at this point, unless there's some documentation. And to this point, I have seen no documentation by those who have, made this suggestion.
On October 22nd, 1758, Colonel Henry Champion wrote,
"A large number of bateaux sunk this day by parties from the camp. The sloop stripped, and cribs made of planks fastened on the sides of the sloop, and to the land turtle, or tail and end, and filled with stone to sink."
So we developed a hypothesis that there was a possibility that maybe these cribs that Champion wrote about that held rocks, that this vessel had been sunk in shallower water, and then the French came down, they cut the cribs off, they sank in shallow water, the vessel popped to the surface, and then the French took her out to deep water to get rid of her.
We can use the side scan sonar to look for clues to why the RADEAU was sunk. Like the theory that cribs may have been used to hold the vessel down. Previously, our resolution wasn't good enough to look for the rock piles or the remains of wooden cribs. Now we can go back into those areas and try and prove or disprove those theories.
So over the summer and autumn of 2004, one of our jobs was to use remote sensing, side scan sonar, to try to find remnants of these, cribs with rocks, to try to see if, we could prove or disprove some of these theories. And we did employ a Klein 3000 side scan sonar. We did find some targets picked up by the sonar that showed rocks about 18 to 20 feet across, about the width of the RADEAU. And we have had numerous dives out there to ground truth these. To date, we have not found anything that supports the theory that the Land Tortoise was put down in shallow water, and then the French came down after the British left in 1758, found it in shallow water, raised it, and then took it out into the middle of the lake and sank it.
The 1758 Land Tortoise is the only one in its class to have been found. The RADEAU class is a type of warship in a long line of watercraft called floating gun batteries. One of the earliest and most unusual of the floating gun batteries was the Korean turtle ship, a late 16th century warship used by the Koreans in a war against Japan. These strange-looking warships had a rounded roof with spikes to prevent boarding. During battle, the vessel's sails were brought down, and they were powered by oars. The turtle ships were armed with cannons, firearms, and bows and arrows. The turtle ship even had a ram at its bow, and a dragon's head was mounted on the prow. Smoke poured out of the dragon's head to not only frighten the enemy, but create a smoke screen. The Land Tortoise RADEAU is in many respects a unique design in the long line of floating gun batteries.
This class of vessels manifests itself throughout the French and Indian War, but also again in the American Revolution. We have references to RADEAU being built to protect cities. We have black ships during the War of 1812, which physically may have been different, but performed the same function of protecting harbors with stationary artillery. And then when we get to the Civil War, we have a number of vessels that look very similar to the RADEAU. The propulsion machinery and the technology may have been different, but they all feature the glaciated sides, beginning with the Merrimack class and continuing with the Union ships that were built on the Mississippi River under Eads' direction. Again, covering the crew members from fire and performing a very valuable defensive structure.
Brought ahead to the modern era, in 1993, the U.S. Navy announced to the public the existence of a prototype of stealth warship built by Lockheed Martin, the same company that manufactured the F-117 stealth aircraft. Named Sea Shadow, the 164-foot-long warship was built in the early to mid-1980s. The vessel's shape utilizes a flat-plate hull, with its upper part angling inward, similar to the tumble-home bulwarks of the Land Tortoise. The Sea Shadow's RADEAU-like design minimizes detection by radar, and its unique hull shape reduces the possibility of sonar detection.
In today's modern Navy, that same trapezoidal shape is being used to deflect radar, as that was used by the colonists to deflect perhaps small arms fire, or even perhaps grape shot or small cannon fire. The angled sides, the thickness of the planks, and the trapezoidal shape both serve a purpose that generations apart, but serve the same purpose of deflecting something.
Today, the Sea Shadow is a test platform for future naval ship engineering and advanced technologies. The Land Tortoise RADEAU shipwreck was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1995.
The National Register of Historic Places was created by the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966. And what that did is it recognized that many of our historic buildings, bridges, and even shipwrecks were disappearing. So it was an attempt by the government, working with the states, to nominate and then to list historic properties. Again, shipwrecks are historic properties. In this way, these historic properties could be protected for posterity. An NHL, or National Historic Landmark, there are only about 2,500 of these in the United States. And these are historic properties that are significant because of their national importance, not just their local or their state importance. The Land Tortoise was made a National Historic Landmark in 1998. In fact, it's only the 6th shipwreck to have that type of recognition, thus showing that it is indeed North America's oldest intact warship.
A relatively small number of submerged resources have been included as National Historic Landmarks, and underwater archaeology now is coming of age, and we're very glad that the Land Tortoise has been added to the list of National Historic Landmarks. It joins the ranks of historic ships such as the Arizona, which is of undoubted significance during the invasion of Pearl Harbor. We have the Maple Leaf, the Monitor, a number of other vessels that have been designated as National Historic Landmarks. I've had the privilege of diving on the site twice now, and it really is a remarkable experience to come face to face with something built during the French and Indian War that remains in a pristine, unaltered condition. That to me is a tremendous experience, and one that I hope through good stewardship and the work of Bateau Below and the other state agencies we'll be able to extend to future generations.
Everybody thinks about the technology to locate shipwrecks. But in reality, that technology can be used to manage these resources. Using side-scan sonar to locate shipwrecks is very common, but to be able to go back to a site year after year and re-image that site, we can tell a lot about what's happening on the site without having to be there 24 hours a day.
These management strategies may help deter vandalism to some degree, but they cannot protect the RADEAU from threats of nature. One emerging threat to the Land Tortoise, as well as other fragile historic shipwrecks in North America, is not from human intrusion.
Zebra mussels are an invasive species in the United States. They're about thumbnail-size mussels with black and white stripes.
These mollusks have invaded many North American freshwater bodies since introduced to this continent in the mid-1980s.
Zebra mussels have the ability to attach on to any hard substrate or surface, and a shipwreck certainly falls into that category. In water bodies where you have important shipwrecks as well as zebra mussels, that has been seen in Lake Champlain and other places, you can essentially have the shipwreck being encrusted by these zebra mussels, a similar way as they attach onto docks or other things. And when they encrust onto the shipwrecks, you're not able to see the features and you're not able to enjoy the preservation of those shipwrecks that you otherwise would be able to.
In December 1999, Bateau Below divers Bob Benway and Joe Zarzinski discovered adult zebra mussels in the southwest corner of Lake George. Bateau Below and the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute have teamed up to use scuba divers to hand harvest these mollusks and minimize their spread throughout the lake. Other groups, like the Lake George Association, Lake George Park Commission, and the Fund for Lake George, are also working to educate the populace about the spread of these exotic invaders. Fortunately, to date, no zebra mussels have been found at the RADEAU or any of the many other shipwreck sites in the lake. The spread of zebra mussels to shipwrecks is only one potential hazard that threatens North America's oldest intact warship. The most serious threat to this historic battlecraft, however, may be apathy. Though Bateau Below has done an admirable job as a friends group studying and helping to protect the Land Tortoise RADEAU, some in government have been painstakingly slow to support strategies to safeguard this non-renewable cultural resource. The lost RADEAU has been found. It provides researchers and the public with an unparalleled opportunity to view the past, a time when two mighty European nations, Britain and France, battled for a North American empire. Ironically, the battle for the Land Tortoise RADEAU continues today. Will this unique 18th century floating gun battery be lost to future generations? This is a question that you, the viewer, will answer.